the sheer amount of work that the NRF does, especially from a loss prevention perspective, I mean, it's incredible. And I understand that you have 10 standing committees that basically focus on loss prevention services and assistance for the retailers. Can you talk about those 10 committees and the people that are involved and some of the objectives and some of the things that they're doing?
The way the committees were structured really focuses on the needs of the industry and where we've been and where we're headed through new technologies, through issues that are coming up in the retail world and through the loss prevention discipline. So some are very specific in nature, things like organized retail crime, addressing the major criminal issues in the field. The Investigators Network, which is a way of local loss prevention folks and law enforcement and mall security to get together talking about very specific issues in their community, but also the bigger national NRF challenges that we've recognized through the industry. And then others, a little bit more strategic in nature. There's a conference planning committee, which Rich and Gary both mentioned, that look at what the education track for the NRF might look like, where we focus legislatively in going after new federal bills, but also working closely with our state and local partners on state crime and civil forfeiture and other issues that might be better addressed through the community area or through the statewide legal aspects. And then some more human nature type committees, if you will. There's a Women in Loss Prevention Caucus, a way of better connecting women in the industry, which really has now expanded into a diversity committee, if you will, an inclusion committee where anyone's invited, men and women. It's a lot of talk about development and your career and how you move forward and excel in the industry. We spend time now on education. There's an education committee. Actually, the NRF just completed a study with Northern Michigan University looking at what the requirements are of certain companies in the country for higher education, how people move up and progress through their careers with a degree versus certification versus just internal street smarts. And then really we continue to evaluate what the needs of the industry look like. Tomorrow we're hosting an emerging technologies workshop and session. That may very well be the next place that we go, and really taking a deep dive on the new point of sale systems, the new payment technologies, and the new way that retail will operate going forward.
Very successful for the NRF, or those 10 committees that you've got.
Well, it's been a big deal for the NRF in a few ways. One, traditionally trade associations run one big conference a year, and they do a good job of providing educational content. The committees have allowed the NRF to really connect with people throughout the year. It's much like our marketing and our PR way of making people aware that the NRF is out there, drawing people into the discussion, getting people engaged. That way, during the conference, it's not the first time they've heard about issues like ORC or e-fencing or emerging technology challenges that companies are facing. It's already an active discussion on the table, and the conference is a way of perhaps benchmarking, or as Gary mentioned, networking with your peers to figure out what you might do going forward.
Well, and it sounds like engagement is really the key here, both from Gary and Rich and yourself, is that the NRF is really geared towards engaging the loss prevention community in every aspect of the show, the committees, legislation, whatever it may be. I mean, is that a correct assumption?
Absolutely, no question.
Switching subjects a little bit, Joe, being that you are a subject matter expert in this specific area, can you give us an update on ORC legislation and the NRF involvement with that legislation, and where are we going over the next year or two with that?
Well, organized retail crime legislation has been on the table now for many years. 7 years ago, the U.S. Congress passed H.R. 3402, which defined organized retail crime. It established organized retail theft task force at the federal level and was supposed to provide some funding to the Department of Justice to deploy federal resources on the crime. Unfortunately, the funding never came, but the federal resources specifically FBI, groups like ICE and Secret Service, all started to take a deep interest in ORC at the national level and how things might evolve in crossing our borders, funding terrorism, looking at the cross-jurisdictional nature of ORC crimes. With H.R. 3402 came a following from the states. Some states already had organized retail crime legislation, like New Jersey. Other states really started to focus on the issue. Places like Florida and Washington and Massachusetts and New Hampshire all have now proposed or put forward new bills. And just in the past year, we've seen great traction. Texas just updated their ORC law. Illinois just put in and updated some laws they had addressing organized retail crime. And there's a handful of states looking at the 2012 legislative agenda, organized retail crime or related crimes that are out there. Unfortunately, legislation is one of those moving targets. Nothing gets done in Washington quickly. In 2010, H.R. 5932, which is the Organized Retail Theft Investigation and Prosecution Unit bill, which was proposed in the House, passed with flying colors. Unfortunately, at that same time, the Senate was talking about things like healthcare, taxes, don't ask, don't tell. So their legislative agenda was full, and it never made it to the Senate. And in 2010, the legislative congressional session all changed. The bill hasn't been reintroduced. We're now working with members of Congress on both sides and both parties to have something introduced, and hopefully it'll happen in the near future.
Any timeline on that, or that you care to just make a prediction on?
Well, if I had made the prediction last year, I would have said before the end of 2011, and that clearly didn't work out. So, we're all hopeful that something will get done. A big change in 2010 was the addition and partnership of eBay. The online marketplaces had traditionally been the chief opposition to any federal legislation. And in 2010, thanks to the work of Paul Jones and the eBay team, we made some changes to the way we're viewing the problem. They've made some shifts internally at how they see things going forward. And we decided it was time for all of us to get behind one common issue, which was to go after the criminals and to put resources and law enforcement behind the problem. And that really has helped the conversation in Washington, because now when we meet with Democrats or Republicans or House members or senators, everyone understands the common concept. This is really as simple as good versus evil. There are very sophisticated criminal operators out there. We absolutely need new tough federal laws to go after them here in the country and when they slip outside and or funnel money outside of our borders.
I mean, being that you went there, and obviously eBay has made some significant strides on being participative, being engaged, and being involved in the industry and such. But the real issue is, or the one that I should say is still dangling out there, is Craigslist. I mean, the legal problems they have, the issues that they have, they're not cooperating with law enforcement, and they don't care to. You know, do you see anything there legislatively? Do you see any issues there in Washington? Anybody talking about that?
Well, the answer is yes, and I think we're trying to view the problem from a couple of different angles. When you have a third party in the center of a sale transaction of merchandise, let's call them an enabler. They're enabling a seller connect with a buyer somewhere in the country. So the legislation that we're thinking about all revolves around a seller, which might be selling stolen goods, an enabler in the middle, whether or not they make direct or indirect funding through the sale of stolen or fraudulently obtained merchandise, and then the buyer. Clearly, most buyers are unsuspecting, but we need to focus in on first the criminals, the people stealing or fraudulently obtaining the merchandise through tough state and then federal laws. And then there's the folks in the middle that there needs to be some level of accountability. And this is where we've seen great strides by eBay through their ProAct program to become more transparent. There's information that's made available to very specific and credible loss prevention and law enforcement officials to gain sales history and transactional information for the purposes of conducting a criminal investigation. These other marketplaces haven't necessarily come to the table, which is precisely why we need to level the playing field and have federal legislation that addresses enablers as a full spectrum.
Well put, well put. Changing the subject on the three of you again, you know, over the last 5 years, the retail industry has changed dramatically. E-commerce, M-commerce, mobile payments, and the like. You know, what has the NRF done to keep pace with the retail industry?
Well, you know, the NRF, through the annual show and through the committee structure that exists outside of the loss prevention arena, really looks at everything from privacy to regulations that take place through specific retail action and others. Here at the annual convention in New York, or during the NRF's annual convention in New York, the new technologies we see here at the show will hit the marketplace in 2, 3, 5 years from now. As technology evolves, we're seeing a much shorter to market timeline for those service providers. So the NRF is engaging in discussions about digital privacy and about intellectual property rights and about how the industry is moving forward from a legislative and a regulatory environment. Unfortunately, some administrations favor legislation and regulation more than others. As an example, right now the EEOC is examining laws related to criminal history checks on retailers. And while this sounds like a noble effort initially to protect people's privacy, and there may be some isolated cases of abuse, by and large, retailers and a number of other private sector companies utilize criminal histories to screen employees and make sure that they're providing a safe environment, as OSHA requires.
Well, and as some states have outlawed the background checks of credit reports.
That's right.
Massachusetts, Chicago, and a few others
That's right.
recently have done that in the last couple of years.
Well, we're seeing some states what we call ban the box, where they're, and which is what the EEOC is proposing, to remove the question about criminal histories off of the employment application. And that's a very scary proposition. I mean, nobody wants to think about taking their children into a store and having a known sex offender behind the register, or having a pizza delivery guy with a history of home invasion burglaries. So we need to be very careful, and those are the types of issues that the NRF's government relations team, as well as the industry committees, are all focused on.